My name is Art Chang, and I'm running for mayor of New York City.
Okay. Why are you running for mayor of New York City?
Well, I'm running because our city needs to work for everyone. Our problems are interconnected. I believe that's the key to solving them, not from the top down, but from the bottom up in partnership with our communities. I have 30 years of experience improving our city. I served under 4 mayors and 2 governors. I built Queens West. I co-created NYC Votes. I also started 12 small businesses here in New York City. I launched our tech startup industry. I built Casebook, the first web-based software platform for child welfare.
Okay. So if you were elected, what would be the first thing that you would do once you got into office?
The first thing I would do is manage COVID and the economic crisis. We need to restore the fabric of our communities, end the eviction crisis, as well as end the built up debt from the eviction moratoria. We need to reverse homelessness, restart schools, do everything safely, keep everyone safe.
So you mentioned the crux of the way you feel like you would fix things is in understanding that things are interconnected. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit for people who don't understand?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the eviction crisis is a great place to start. People talk about ending the rise in homelessness, but fail to connect it back to the evictions that we face. So when people are in risk of losing their homes, that's where you result in homelessness. So to prevent homelessness, you need to keep people in their homes. Now, the rent problem is obviously a very, very thorny one because people pay rent to landlords who turn around and pay mortgages and property taxes. So the only way to solve the eviction problem is to actually address the mortgage and property tax problem. So that leads then to homelessness. So we can solve it from all different directions.
Okay. In terms of, so homelessness and affordable housing really do go hand in hand as well, jumping off of
Yes.
that connectability point. How would you go about creating more affordable housing for New Yorkers that desperately need it?
Well, we have to have the largest low-income housing program that we've had since NYCHA was created. I mean, the size of the problem is absolutely enormous. There are 640,000 people living in NYCHA houses that were designed for about 440,000 people. And that's kind of a signal for how little low-income housing we really have. The other one is that there are over 200,000 eviction cases pending in housing court, which is roughly the equivalent of the population of Boston. So when you look at these things together, the size of the problem is enormous. And so you might ask why? Well, since 1990, the city's population has increased by almost 1 million people, and we have built only a couple 100,000 units of housing. And the income gap has also widened during that period. And so what we've done is we've taken the bulk of that home construction and oriented it toward the luxury and upper end of the market, but actually not done anything for low income or no income folks. So we need to do that.
Okay. Is in any part of that, would you look at revising the way that the city does zoning projects to help create affordable housing?
Absolutely. We need to look at the set zoning from a citywide perspective. The approach that this administration is taking is extremely fragmented and piecemeal. It feels almost reactive and opportunistic as opposed to strategic and long-term thinking. We have to look at really what the total need is and to figure out what the places are around the city where it can be equitably and fairly distributed to meet everyone's needs. Because it doesn't make any sense to continue what we already have, which is essentially low-income communities with no income diversity, which can't therefore support things like retail and other services around it. So we need to figure out how we integrate low-income folks throughout the city so that we give them an opportunity to have a livable environment. My personal style as mayor would be to set the vision, articulate it as best I can, lay a path, at least a hypothetical path for how we might get there, and then invite the communities around the city to be able to come in and actually have a conversation. No one has actually done this before, so we need to figure out how to do it again, do it the right way. There are so many different channels to communicate with people that haven't been explored before. right? People live in Facebook, they live in Twitter, they live in Instagram. Some people live in still in phone or in paper. So we have to actually figure out a way to get all different people involved in using every single mode of communication that we have available to us. It's never been done before, but I think we can do that. The whole way that I've built everything in my career has been through collaboration with varied audiences. Because I believe firmly that if you actually don't bring in the end users of the products or services into the process, you can't be successful. So we must do this. We have to figure it out. And I know the communities are dying for a conversation, with the government to figure out how we build these things and succeed together.
Talking more about building up institutions that already exist. I know you had some CUNY experience. Can you talk to me a little bit about what that experience is and how you would try to change not just CUNY, but the other public schools that 1 million students attend within?
Yeah, leadership is so important. There's been a leadership change at CUNY since I was involved, and I think that's kind of an interesting opportunity for change. And let me just describe what we try to do. At that time, the software industry in New York City, the startup community, was complaining about a shortage of qualified software developers here in New York City. And I turned around and said, well, there's this little school down the street called Cuny with 250,000 students. I think there are a few that actually could be qualified. And so we worked together with the computer science faculty. We found that there were actually over 10,000 computer science students. And they weren't actually given the opportunity to get jobs in the startup community because there were some significant barriers that had to be bridged. So for example, almost all of CUNY students are immigrants and poor. And as a result, they don't come from the same social milieu as the folks who are actually doing tech startups, who are mostly white, mostly men, and mostly from affluent backgrounds. So the first thing we had to do is actually cross that cultural divide. And that took a fair amount of effort. But now that translated into an apprenticeship program that is turned into the CUNY Tech Meetup, which now has about 5,000 students involved. So we know we can do that, but we wanted to take it the next step further, which was to start to bring in accreditation and certification programs from the private sector into CUNY. So that CUNY students had an opportunity to take 4-credit courses, get the certifications necessary, which would give them this on-ramp into really well-paying private sector jobs. And in doing so, really develop a different path for CUNY students. Instead of necessarily going to school full-time, they could go to school part-time, get these certifications, and that their education will be able to proceed in step with their earnings capabilities. And I think that program actually, is needed today more than ever. So I think there's ample opportunities to do that. Then you asked about the schools themselves, the public schools, which are obviously administered under a separate, which are under mayoral control and under a separate structure. The public schools can also do something similar in high school. I mean, I remember, in Akron, Ohio, where I grew up, by 8th grade, I had taken metal shop and wood shop and home ec. I knew how to sew. I knew how to cook. I knew how to do light construction. There's no reason that today here in New York, we can't actually expose students in high school to many of those same things. A lot of students have to work. So why don't we create a way for students to incorporate their work and their education in parallel? Maybe high school doesn't take 4 years. Maybe for some students, it takes 6 years or 8 years. And maybe for other students, CUNY is integrated right into high school. So it's a seamless transition. That's really my vision for the future, that students, we meet every student where they're at, economically, developmentally, and provide them the resources they need so that they can actually progress with their lives in the best, most sustainable way possible.
Okay. Tying into that, I know you also have a history in studying women's issues, but also have a platform that wants to promote universal childcare, that ties into the very beginning of a child's education. So talk to me about why that's important and your vision for that.
Yeah, there are very few issues that are as important to me as women's equality. And it comes from my upbringing. When I was growing up, I lived in a domestic violence household. And my mother, who had emigrated to the US to study, she was in the second class of women to graduate with a medical degree in Korea. And then to find herself in a marriage where she was unable to pursue her profession because of the violence and the conditions that she was subject to, for my entire childhood, really gave me a resolve that we needed to actually do something to improve the lot of women. That maybe as a child I couldn't do it for my mother, but that I needed to pay it forward. And so I look at where we are today, and we look at what's happened in COVID, where parents have had to face a terrible choice between work and their children. Women's employment has dropped to the same level that it was in 1989. In the past 10 months, women's economic progress has gone back 30 years, 3 decades. It's unbelievable. And today, three women's jobs are being lost for every one man's job. And that's really a terrible loss for women. Women's equality is so important in so many ways, because it's not just important, it's important for the economy, but it's also very important for kids. I know that having a mom who was a professional, who continued to study every day, no matter what happened at home, really set for me this idea for what women should do. And that for me, women's equality really begins at the home. So universal childcare is a natural outgrowth of that. It's about equality for women. It's about reducing stress for families. It's about leveling the playing field for children. I mean, we know that there is no more important time for kids than when they're infants through toddlers. And having universal childcare where we can establish a common playing field for nutrition, healthcare, mental health, physical and brain development is one of the most effective ways that we can level the playing field across the city. The centers can also become sources for employment for women, especially in the inner city. Women who today may have unpaid jobs taking care of kids, but who can convert that into certification and a path toward professionalizing the thing that they've always done. I think it's a tremendous opportunity, and those can become community centers for the distribution of things like food and diapers and women's hygiene products, but also a place where parents can learn how to be parents. I mean, I remember I had the good fortune of having high quality childcare. And I know that I had no clue how to be a parent of an infant, but I learned so much from the teachers in that center who really showed me everything from how do you play with a kid to how do you act, to what they need, how do you put them down for a nap? Just really tremendously valuable. I think all families should have that. All women should have that. It's been estimated, there's an economist in Chicago who has estimated that universal childcare could create a 13% annual ROI for the economy if we had it. And so that's a tremendous economic boost that would lift all boats. I'm so encouraged that this has become a national issue, that Congresswomen Meng and Velasquez have introduced something called the Marshall Plan for Moms, which also includes universal childcare. So there may be federal assistance in the works to be able to help pay for this. But nonetheless, I think we can do that just on our own here in New York City.
I have a few. So I'm glad you spoke about where you come from, because that was going to be my next question. But your roots as a New Yorker are, and you can tell me more obviously, but New York was kind of the land of opportunity. You came here decades ago. Just talk to me about why you decided to move to New York and your roots here in the city.
Yeah, okay. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was a little boy, I read a book called From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. which recounted the story of two kids who became engrossed in an art mystery at the Metropolitan Museum. They, on a school trip, they ran away from the school. They hid and they lived in the museum for a week, doing their own independent research on this mystery. And then they met this mysterious wealthy woman who donated this piece to the museum, and it gave me the sense that New York had all the things that I loved that I wasn't really getting in Ohio. It had the love of art, the kids who were interested in solving interesting problems that were academic and intellectual, that there was the ability to meet all these fabulous people. And in Ohio, you're called a sissy if you liked art, and you were beaten up if you were too smart and your grades were really good. And and then being Asian, being the only Asian family in my school, it was really a kind of a source of constant concern when I walked out in the street, how it would be addressed. And so as I learned more and more about New York, I developed this dream of coming to New York that really has been with me since I was a child. In 1985, when I graduated from Yale, I came to New York with $400 in my pocket, and I really struggled. I didn't have a job. I got a part-time job. Many times I couldn't pay the rent. I sometimes had trouble putting food on the table. I did better and eventually started a business when I was 24. I did too well at that business and became overconfident, made some terrible mistakes. I lost everything. I went bankrupt. I lost everything when my largest client went bankrupt. And I went back to struggling again. But it was really one of the great moments that happened to me. I was in this great city and I looked around at all the people who I was surrounded by. And I said, I'm really lucky. I'm really lucky to have going through this experience. I'm young, I'm healthy. I have a Yale degree. I'm not Black. So my chances for rebuilding my career were going to be much, much easier than most people. And I've had this tremendous learning experience of having failed. I do want to say something about when I moved to Brooklyn, I chose Brooklyn because Spike Lee was down the street and it was a home of hip hop. I moved here because Brooklyn to me was the creative capital of the world, and I wanted to be in the thick of things. And I never regretted it. I've been here ever since. Yes.
Where in Brooklyn are you?
I'm in Prospect Heights.
So starting just with the NYPD and improving the relationship with the people they're supposed to be protecting, what first steps would you try to take to make sure that that is a situation that improves instead of gets worse, especially as we, head back into the summer and are looking towards that?
Yeah. Well, if I might, let me put this in context to what's happening right now. As you know, there's been a huge rise in anti-Asian hate crime here in New York City. And New York City is actually leading the entire country in incidents of anti-Asian hate crime. So there are lots of calls to, for, special task force and the police, more policing. And so it's kind of become a very, very hot topic. On the anti-Asian hate, I do want to address that. I was born in 1963 in Jim Crow Atlanta, at a time when Asian immigration had been illegal and violent anti-Asian discrimination was essentially the unsanctioned law of the land for about 100 years before that. And it was really only because of the civil rights movement were Asians able to chart a path toward more equality. In fact, the Asian immigration was only made legal in 1965 when I was 2 years old, and as a direct result of the civil rights movement. So we look at kind of where we are today with the anti-Asian hate, and it's a tragedy that our last president has really rekindled that because of this calling COVID the Chinese flu and other hateful things. But it is, in some respects, not surprising because of our legacy of anti-Asian hate in this country. So we look at what we want to do, and with respect to policing. And I'm with the folks like the Asian American Feminist Collective who believe that the right answer is not to increase the amount of police forces, the armed forces, to protect our communities, that the community protection should be community-based and based on the community self-actualization around certain initiatives. So let's talk about policing for a sec. So there are a few things about policing that are fundamentally broken in the city. This idea that safety and policing are connected is not true, right? So we think about, if policing and safety were connected, then you could simply add more police and we would be more safe, right? And I don't think anybody actually agrees with that. So instead, we have to look at where we are. I mean, New York City has more police per capita than all but 4 cities. We're in the top 4 in the country. And then when you look at the number of police that we have per murder, we are off the charts high. So we are, what I would say, we are over-policed, yet we are under-policed. That the police are not present on the streets to be able to prevent the kind of violence that we're seeing in places like Flushing and against Asians and against other folks for that matter. The whole rise in Black on Black shootings around the city is a total tragedy. This comes down to a few things. Number one is governance. In a democratic society, one of our fundamental pillars is that the police, the armed forces, report to the duly elected civilian head. We clearly don't see that happening in our city. As part of it, there's also a balance of powers. Today, the police chief has 100% of authority over just disciplinary issues. That's also wrong. There's no checks and balances. The Civilian Complaint Review Board, which is supposed to be the checks and balances, is underfunded, understaffed, and when it has investigations and determinations, who does it make its recommendations to? The police chief. So the whole kind of proper relationship of the governance of the police force with respect to our city is broken, and we can fix that. The second thing that would
you replace the police chief with an elected chief?
No, I don't believe in that. I think the mayor should have control over the appointment of the police chief. However, because I believe so strongly in the balance of powers, that I would open the door to a conversation with the city council about having a role in approving that police chief. In fact, there's a bill right now in front of city council, right, that would actually call for that, and I am in favor of that, and would welcome that kind of balance. The second issue that I want to talk about is actually related to how we respond to crises. Right today, when you call 911, 100% of the response is with somebody with a gun and prepared for a potential violent conflict. And that preparation alone can create violence and conflict. So what needs to happen, and this is kind of in the context of the fact that 94% of 911 calls around the country don't require, armed intervention, that we need to think about how we change the nature of the response to crisis, to experiment and put into place unarmed forces that include violence interrupters, social workers, mental health professionals who can respond on a 24/7, 365 basis like police do. I also think that we need to put more of these folks on the street so that we can actually engender more safety and more prevention, like in the communities that are most affected by this kind of violence. And then the third thing we need to really think about is like, what does it mean to have safety? Right? We started with that, but that is a fundamental question. And does safety begin and end with an arrest, or does safety begin and end with something different? I would argue that safety begins and ends with a healthy community. That when you have a community that has low stress, that has jobs, where it has good schools, that has adequate food, is secure in their housing, then we're going to have a safer city. And I think all the statistics showed that. We look at what was happening before COVID with very low unemployment. We had a very, very safe city. I know we can get back to that. In fact, I know we can do better than that.
I have one follow-up police related question and then a fun question, and then we should be good. So when you talk about shifting, and if it's not shifting resources, please correct me, shifting resources so that there is more sort of community involvement in policing. So are you in favor of, so domestic violence calls, we're shifting that to a different task force, and then we're just made up of community members, slash, are you in favor of different task forces within the NYPD, like the Asian Hate Crime Task Force that specifically exists for that kind of community policing as it's supposed to be ideally? Or would you want to, is there like a mix between there that your ideal situation is?
Yeah, I have a lot of flexibility around those conversations. And I'll just go back to, the rise in the murder rate in the city. There are communities, primarily Black communities, that are experiencing this surge in shootings, and some of them have called for more police on the street. Because their theory is that if there are people running around with guns, shooting people, and potentially harming unarmed people, then we need to have armed people on the street ready to respond quickly. And if that's what they want, then we have to give that a try. But we also need to be able to do other things. So on domestic violence situations, for example, there's certainly domestic violence situations where the man is really, there's a risk of the man killing his partner. But there are others where it's a super violent situation that could be diffused. And I'll just tell you from my own experience with my own parents, the thing that I would do often when I sensed arguments on the verge of boiling over, that I would grab each of them by the hand and make them sit down. And the act of a boy doing this would sometimes would get them out of that groove, and it would enable them to actually have a rational conversation, and we could diffuse it. So I know we can do it. Whether it applies in every situation, I don't have the expertise to figure it out. Whether every victim wants that, I also don't know. But we have to expand the options that we have for response so that we can start to think about lowering the temperature on all kinds of these incidences, lowering the stress, and enabling people to go back on and figure out ways that really resolve those situations on a longer term basis. Domestic violence, and I'll address this for a second, should be treated as a health issue. It's a public health issue. It's a chronic issue. And it is a chronic issue that affects not just the man and the woman involved, but it affects their children and their neighbors. It impacts everybody and has long-term potential for harm. And so if we treat it as a public health issue, then I think we'll be able to come at it with many, many more tools than we do today.